No need to overdo it, you know. We just turned up here. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Let me welcome on behalf of The Spectator and on behalf of our sponsors, Brew and Dolphin, who have made tonight's panel possible. You know the subject. Is the BBC really a national treasure? You're welcome to tweet as it goes on. This isn't under the Chatham House rule. It's open to the public. We're recording it. It'll be posted on the Spectator website as well. The Wi-Fi username is CHCC, all capital, CHCC guest, and the password is autumn 2015. So that's not too difficult to remember. I thank all of our panel. We've got a very distinguished panel here tonight. I particularly thank Rachel Johnson, who stepped in at short notice. She was writing her speech as we were speaking a minute ago. Since we've got you all here, let me tell you that we are giving away a pair of tickets to the famous Spectator Christmas Carol service on the 9th of December. So if you'd like to come to that, please do so. It's for a great cause. I think this year we've chosen the Macmillan Nurses. All you have to do is fill out your details on the prize draw card, put it in the boxes as you leave the hall. We're also going to give away a special Christmas gift to you, but I'm going to tell you about that later, really just to keep you here. We have 6 panelists, as you can see tonight. 2 will speak pretty much in favour, answering yes, that the BBC is something of a national treasure. 2 will be a bit more ambivalent, and 2 will say it's less of a treasure than the BBC thinks. You may regard it as somewhat strange that a BBC presenter should be chairing this event tonight, given it's about the BBC. I do so in my role as chairman of the Spectator magazine group. I will, of course, be scrupulously impartial as always, and I think it was a Labour politician that said to me that I was to the BBC what Frank Field is to the Labour Party. So you can take that as a plus or a minus. We decided the speaking order a little earlier. We're going to kick off, it's interesting given the subject is the BBC really a national treasure? We're going to start with a national treasure, author and broadcaster Melvyn Bragg. Melvyn.
I'd like to make a few opening notes about this, and to start with, it does seem rather like it that the BBC is a national treasure when you look around. There are no street protests, or where are they? I've come across them, against the BBC, but there are street protests and household protests and protests up and down everywhere if the BBC tinkers with itself in any way. It is treated by its loyal subjects very respectfully. And despite all the talk about digital's overwhelming terrestrials, terrestrial channels rule. And the high terrestrial audiences of BBC 1 and 2 and increasing audiences for its main radio channels indicate steady state of loyalty of the audiences for the BBC. And which channels on radio and television do people turn to in times of national and international emergencies? It's the BBC. And can anybody think of a better replacement for this country's international reputation were the World Service to be unhooked from the BBC? I could go on, and I hope others will, but time is limited. The American novelist Paul Bowles, talking about one of his more famous novelist friends, said rather acidly that this famous friend had become a national monument in the American idea of national treasure. The chief consequence, as far as he could see, was that all the dogs in the neighbourhood went to piddle against him. The BBC suffers from what can be seen an excess of piddling, and it has done over the last since the 1920s. It's felt by some to be too imperialistic, too indulgent, too executive-packed with fat cats, too dominant in news, too parochial, too left, too right, too centre. And in all these accusations, there's grains of truth, partly because its remit is to be all things to all people, which isn't easy. But these problems are not easily solvable, but they are solvable, given the will and the confidence. What there can be little doubt of is that over the last 90 years, the BBC has educated, informed and entertained this nation like no other cultural institution before or since, now existing, now in prospect, and how will that be encouraged to continue? I think the problem may be to find an irreducible argument for the continuation of the BBC keeping in the form it is today, keeping in full play over the next decades? Is it enough to talk about its contributions to society, to say that the BBC is at the hub of the creative vortex which makes this country per capita a dynamic and the leading dynamic location for the arts in the world, employing about 2 million people, which the arts do, mostly in skilled niche jobs, 7% and rising of the economy, and making London the world capital of the arts? Well, if it's not enough, it's certainly a start. And what about the unique reach of its bespoke radio programmes? People measure out their days on Radio 4. And is it too much to charge £3 a week for this, when the British public in large numbers has grown accustomed to paying much more for programming it wants to see on subscription channels? But there's a parallel universe, and it's growing quickly, powerfully, and some BBC defenders think menacingly. The new subscription channels, like ITV when it arrived on the block, were thought by some BBC public service holders to be doomed to certain failure. They were wrong about ITV, and they're wrong about the new subscription channels. Some of them have got a real grip. They've expanded, and new channels have caught on, often with unanticipated authority and clout. What's been built up is a foundation for a network of non-BBC services, which means that many people would claim they can get by without watching the BBC, without watching BBC television, and at no loss to themselves. In my view, there are other real dangers to the BBC, many, but to take one example. It's said that, rightly, the BBC is the bedrock of independent productions in this country, and independents are now the bedrock of British television in drama, comedy and films. But that could ebb away. Channel 4 set up the market, it's still a big player. Sky has already entered the market, and other major programme streams come on, Netflix and so on, they're arriving all the time. Were the BBC to be diminished, the independents, like artists over the centuries, would likely make a dash for where the money is, as artists always do, and leave the BBC, and the migration has begun. And there's the awkward fundamental problem of how far and how influentially in a largely democratic capitalist society can a non-democratic, powerful, non-commercial body be protected and given special privileges. At present, the BBC stands with a strategy and a vision that attracts fine talents and has produced very great work. How can it be maintained like that? There was something in the early Middle Ages called the matter of Britain problem. Rather apprehensively, I'd like to use the phrase here, the matter of Britain, and the BBC is very much part of it. How much of us in this country do we want to sell off, see subverted or surrender? And how much of us do we want to keep because we think it's sometimes the best of us, and once gone it will not be rebuilt? This essential matter of Britain matters to us and future generations, I think, and the BBC is near the heart of that. In the end, I think we want to stay there and be strong. We want it to stay there and be strong because it speaks not only to us and for us, but about us. It's our Britain that matters. Perhaps this is because we know in our generational bones that we, the British, own the BBC through the licence fee. We should say that more often. We always have done. It's ours. And we know it and act on it. Every day, for some of us, and for some of us through the night, we switch on in our millions. We are the silent majority, voting with our time. We want it to go on. It's ours. It's part of what this country is. The BBC, I think, is not so much a national treasure, but it is a national inheritance.
Melvyn Bragg. Our next panellist is a Conservative MP. He's been campaigning to decriminalise the BBC licence fee evasion, though that, of course, is an issue, but not the only issue we're here to discuss tonight. Please welcome Andrew Bridgen.
The question tonight is the BBC a national treasure? If you'd asked that question 60 years ago, or even 30 years ago, no doubt you would have had an overwhelming yes. Ask the question of a certain section of the population who remember a time when it was the BBC or nothing. The BBC can draw on a huge nostalgic affection, and it retains that role in the hearts of many. However, to an increasing number of people, the BBC does not have this credit to draw on. For many of those who've grown up in an era of the internet and multi-channel choice, the BBC is just another channel. And for those who choose, like me, to dig a little deeper into the BBC, they'll find that far from being a national treasure, the BBC, in fact, has been hijacked in my view, by a class of manager who are not there for the primary reason of public service broadcasting, to inform, to educate and to entertain, but people who inhabit a world of power without accountability, who lust after giant salaries and in which many cases wouldn't be on offer in the commercial sector. Under this BBC management structure, we've seen attempts to cover up for the prolific paedophile Jimmy Savile, to cover up the truth about Kids Company. We've seen the Danny Cohen-inspired Lovey's letter and the deceit of the press there. The digital project, which lost £100 million of taxpayers' money. Political bias, partial coverage of important national issues such as climate change, immigration and Europe. This is an organisation, the BBC, that wants all the benefits of the private sector, all the protections of the public sector, and to maintain a governance regime made up of its own cheerleaders, rather than regulators. If their commercial rivals fail, their company goes bust. If a BBC management fails, they get a 6- or 7-figure payoff, huge salaries, or home-based jobs with meaningless titles. The lack of faith in the regulation of the BBC is borne out by figures from YouGov that state that only 29% of people support the current regime for regulation by the BBC Trust. The fact is the workings of the management of the BBC are so opaque that they make the men in grey suits 1950s-style selection of a Conservative Party leader seem democratic. The stated aim of the BBC Trust is to make decisions in the best interest of the licence fee payers. On this premise, the current structure can only be seen as a failure. There is no trust in the BBC Trust. Also, according to YouGov's survey carried out under a year ago, only 44% of viewers think the licence fee was the best way to fund the BBC, with 39% saying it's good value for money against 39% who think it's not. And this is despite a barrage of constant self-congratulatory promotional advertisement in primetime slots by the BBC themselves. The BBC always say that they're world-class, but they take every effort to avoid losing the licence fee and having to compete in the commercial world, preferring the poll tax licence fee and the threat of state prosecution for non-payment. Polling evidence from Comres in August this year found that 52% of the public support the idea of replacing the £145.50 licence fee with advertising, even if that means reduced original programming. If the BBC were to discover a Banana Republic regime that decided to introduce a poll tax for the right of its citizens to view television and to fund a state broadcaster with that money, and further they made it a criminal offence for not paying the tax, and they imprisoned people who didn't pay the fines, and found out that over 70% of the people prosecuted were women, the BBC would quite rightly lead a worldwide media outcry. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is Britain today. And I also think the BBC PR machine should take a long look at itself and the damage it's doing to the BBC brand when, threatened with a possible reduction of its income stream, it says, we'll cut CBeebies and this will be the end of local radio. That is outrageous manipulation of public opinion. Instead of engaging with the debate, the BBC used all its powers to deflect. We move on to BBC Worldwide, the so-called commercial arm of the BBC, which is anything but, tasked with selling the back catalogue of the BBC, funded by the taxpayer and added to every year by the taxpayer around the world. It has a turnover of about £1.3 billion, but despite this, it only returns approximately about 10% to the taxpayer. This is pure empire building. You would certainly expect an entity such as that selling something which has already been paid for by the taxpayer, it's already been made, added to every year to return at least 80% of that turnover to the taxpayer. In conclusion, the BBC is like an addict refusing rehab. It is incapable of change, whilst it maintains a senior management structure that is the problem rather than the solution. If the BBC was serious about adapting to the new media world, it would remove these posts, paying in excess of £300,000 a year, which do not exist in other media outlets, and whose incumbents have been known to take up jobs following no advert and no formal interview process. In conclusion, most organisations are kept on the straight and narrow by accountability to customers or shareholders or even electors. The current BBC funding model and regulatory model means that it is accountable to no one. And even in its discussions over its future and role and size during charter renewal, they see it as being an insult and an affront, such is the arrogance of the management of the BBC. It's an elite, it's a covering-up management model which wouldn't survive 5 minutes in any other media operation or corporate situation. And it is dragging the BBC brand to the point where rather than being a national treasure, it's becoming just another broadcaster trying to be a jack of all trades. For many, the BBC is a London-centric organisation that represents taxation without representation. In my region, the Midlands, they take 25% of all, we pay 25% of all the licence fee, but we get 2.5% of the BBC's spend. For the reasons I've highlighted, I think the number of people supporting the BBC is diminishing and will continue to diminish. I think for the millions of people given a criminal record, 1 in 8 of all magistrate cases for non-payment of the TV licence, for them, the BBC, if it is a treasure, it's one that they'd like to bury.
Andrew Bridgen. And our third panellist tonight is journalist and broadcaster Rachel Johnson.
Thank you. I have to say this is much scarier than doing question time, or have I got news for you? Danny Cohen, the late lamented, what was he, head of TV?
Well, he hasn't died, he's just moved on.
Well, you know what I mean. Danny Going said something like, we're not going to have panel shows with no women on them anymore. And I slightly feel that not only do we have to have panel shows with a token woman, we have to have panel shows about the BBC with a token woman. But on that basis, this token woman is here to speak as a sort of agnostic. But I did work for a very happy 2.5 years, as I think almost every member of this panel has, apart from Andrew Bridgen, on the BBC. And I came away from that experience thinking this is an organisation that takes self-scrutiny to a ridiculous degree, but it also does a lot of things right, and I'm very glad I had the experience of working there. When I left the BBC, I went to work in a magazine called The Lady, and the paper said I did a revamp, at which point I was called back into the BBC to give a presentation by Gwyneth Williams, who is then and is still the head of Radio 4, and she said, Rachel, I want you to come in and go over the Radio 4 schedule. Tell us what you think. In my sloppiness, I failed to open the attachment which accompanied this invitation. So I turned up to NBH and I tore up the Radio 4 schedule in the sense that I said, I lunge for the off button when it's broadcast, not when it's broadcasting, I love broadcasting. I sort of went through the schedule. I said, you and yours is very dull and I don't like any answers, and I reserve particular scorn for you, you and yours. And then I said, money box. And then I said, I can't bear the food programme. By the way, the food programme on Saturday, I slightly take it all back, did a whole one on the Scotch egg. Anyway, at the end, the lights went up and the first person who put their hand up said, hello, I'm X, or can't remember his name, the editor of You and Yours. Do you know that the reason all those programmes remain on the schedule is not because we're trying to be entertaining? If we have money, we wouldn't necessarily make all those programmes. Those programmes are cheap, and we have a responsibility to deliver on budget these programmes. And yes, in an ideal world, we would be making different ones, but these remain on the schedule, one, because some of the listeners like them, and because they're value for money. So I'm going to carry on for a bit on what I regard as the pros. I think that value for money is a pro. I read somewhere, it's £145.50 a year. John Sessions said, this is the price of a Christmas shop, and you get goodies throughout the year. I happen to agree with John Sessions, although we're not allowed to say in the current environment that £145 is actually quite cheap. It is, if you think what you get for your money. Claire Enders, who's a media analyst, and I actually don't understand this, and I hope somebody much more expert on the panel will explain. She says BBC content is incredibly good value for around 13p an hour for those living in single-person TV households. I'm longing for someone to explain that. But then she goes on to make a really interesting point, which is the most significant. If you're talking about the commercial sector, the BBC does the commercial sector a huge favour by allowing all the advertising to go into the commercial sector. So 60% of the consumption shares 100, i.e. the independent sector, takes 100% of the commercial revenues. So just on finishing on quality, listen, if you tried to find, I tried to listen to French radio during the événement of the kamikaze bombings in Paris. I promise you it was really hard. You end up listening to adverts on France Inter, trying to download podcasts. The BBC does news, wraparound news, whenever you want it, all night long in 28 languages. I can't imagine life without it. Switch on the BBC, switch on the television in any other country, and don't you always end up watching BBC World? Or CNN, maybe, Andrew? Anyway. Okay, I've got to be neutral and go on to some cons. I said that some programmes don't set the world on fire, and there's a reason for that. Savile. Andrew mentioned Savile. I might add to Savile, okay, 1,000 employees were abused and the BBC managers didn't check that abuse and probably knew it was going on. But Dame Janet Smith has done an exhaustive report that held the BBC to account. Too many managers. I didn't know what half the people at the BBC did when I worked there. I used to go and see them, sometimes more often than not, to get a performance bonus. And, you'd meet somebody who had a title, who did something, and I never knew what he did. So there are too many managers, and the BBC does too much. Tony Hall today announced cuts of 150 million. 5 million has gone on news. That's regrettable, but the BBC has done a deal with the government. It has to make, essentially, it's lost 25% of the licence fee budget in real terms, and so it's going to have, because it's paying for worldwide and it's paying for over 75's free licenses, which I don't think it should. The BBC should have stuck that to George and said, no, we're going to make the over 75's pay because we can't afford it, and nor can the licence payer. Right, so I think the licence fee is probably completely anachronistic. Someone come up with a better system, but until they do, I think it's not fair that the BBC gets free money rolling in to the tune of 2.7 billion, but it's by no means the largest media operator on the block. Sky B's budget is 4.7 billion. The BBC is actually the second largest broadcaster, not the first. So it's not fair, but it's still probably right. Have I got time to end with 4 points?
If you can do them in 3 minutes.
Okay,
yes.
fine. So my 4 points, I'm afraid, do come out on the national treasure end of the ledger, because free speech isn't free. There is no such thing as free speech in broadcasting terms unless somebody pays for it. And I think it's worth paying the licence fee to maintain free speech in this country. The internet is in theory free, but every time you log onto the internet, you are paying with your digital DNA. Somebody's making money from you. And if you're happy with that, that's fine. But I like the fact that we pay for the BBC. The BBC is free. It's like an universal ad blocker. We're not getting ads. We're getting content that's largely thoughtful, responsible, neutral, and entertaining and informational and all those things. The other point is, remember that the loudest voices for stopping the licence fee come from those who would profit most from it being removed. I'm not going to mention their names, as I take the shilling of the Times and Sky and so on with gratitude. By funding the BBC, we have helped create an industry in which the UK excels with a number one export of TV formats in the world. We're also stopping ourselves from being swamped by American culture. If we sold out to the American corporations, we would have to Americanize our output. Last point, we are exporting Britain to the world. We are fish and chips and David Beckham, Manchester United, and the BBC. We have our super brands, Top Gear, Doctor Who, Strictly, David Attenborough, Bake Off. They do a huge amount to promote the UK abroad. It's a continuing, ongoing Olympic effect. It keeps us relevant, and if we didn't have the BBC, I would be quite tempted to leave the country and turn the lights out, because left to market forces, what other broadcaster would devote a whole programme to the Scotch egg? Thank you very much.
Rachel Johnson. Our fourth panellist tonight is one of the country's top investigative journalists. Please welcome Marion Jones.
I think the BBC has been a national treasure and can be again, but at the moment it is wobbling. When you think of the two great cultural exports in the second half of the 20th century from Britain, I would say they are British pop and rock from the 60s through punk to now, and the BBC. In terms of the World Service, it is still not a national treasure, but an international treasure. And I would like to see it paid for by the Department for International Development in a generous way, so that the BBC is not making decisions about which country's service to close down. But the BBC is still not recovered from Savile. The licence fee payers still don't trust the BBC. And that's because the BBC commissioned a report, as Rachel mentioned, the Dame Janet Smith report, spent millions on it to learn the lessons of Savile, and that report is sat there finished under lock and key, and it will not be published until after charter renewal if you let them get away with it. The 99% of what is in that Janet Smith report could be published now. There is a tiny amount which the BBC says might be affected by police investigations. That did not stop the BBC at the same time publishing the Panorama programme into rubbishing, really, VIP child abuse, despite the objections of the police that it would interfere with their inquiries. So there is a second reason the BBC gives for not publishing Dame Janet Smith, and they say, oh, it's because it was commissioned by the BBC Trust. Well, there's a very simple answer to that. Abolish the BBC Trust, replace it with Ofcom. Nobody trusts the BBC Trust. Another point I would make is that thousands of journalists are employed by the BBC, and yet it breaks really few stories. Now, papers like The Telegraph and The Mail always said, we don't want to have investigations units, they're not good for the culture. Well, they brought them in, and funnily enough, it's worked. The BBC should learn a lesson from The Telegraph and The Mail. Getting an investigations unit, they should launch it as soon as possible, which supplies stories for daily output, weekly output, and for longer-term stories. So now we get on to what I think is one of the worst cancers, really, at the root of the BBC, and that's the crony culture, been referred to by various other people. And I think the Alan Yentob case at the moment shows that it still continues. The roomfuls of people who sat there and made decisions, or perhaps didn't make decisions, to cover up Savile over the years, and carried on doing that when we were investigating it on Newsnight. The decisions to give £1 million payoffs to each other, all those decisions, that way of working is still working, that cosy, crony method of management. I mean, it's bad enough that Alan Yentob, as head of talent for the BBC, looked through all the talented people he could have chosen and decided that the most talented person to present the BBC's top art show was Alan Yentob. Then you come to what happened with Kids Company. So on Kids Company, you have one of the chieftains of the BBC, nothing to do with news, going around kicking in filing cabinets, shouting, threatening, trying to force the news not to cover what had happened to his favourite charity, what was going on there. And to the credit of Newsnight, they went ahead and broadcast anyhow. But that culture, something has to be done with it, and I think it shows a failure of leadership at Tony Hall's level that he hasn't done anything about that. So, are there cuts that could be made at the BBC? Yes, of course. There are 150 press officers at the BBC, even now. Surely you could get rid of 100, 140 of those and not make much difference to the output. There are things like the online magazine. I mean, it's lovely. There was a nice article about jaywalking and the history of how it became a crime. I loved it, but the BBC shouldn't really be broadcasting stuff like that and putting stuff out like that online. There's all these Radio X extra stations. I don't think the BBC can afford to do that either. But the way that Tony Hall just accepted a £750 million cut in the BBC budget without any public discussion shows to me a complete failure, because that 750 million is being taken from licence fee payers and given to the Department of Work and Pensions. That seems like a mad way to spend the licence fee. So, the other problem with that, of course, is that if government say to you, we'd like you to hand over £750 million, and you say, oh, yeah, fine, funnily enough, it doesn't mean they're going to leave you alone. I mean, they're like the Vikings. They'll be back. They want to be paid that Danegeld. Handing over £750 million without an argument is not a way to safeguard your future. So, the other thing that worries me is this push to say the BBC should become an elite channel. I think that programmes like EastEnders, Match of the Day, Doctor Who, Strictly, the Danny Baker Cradle to Grave, which is a particular favourite of mine, but they're just as important as the shows I worked on, like the Today programme, World at One, PM, Newsnight and Panorama. I fear that Tony Hall would think it was a success if the BBC ended up as Radio 4 plus a 24-hour opera channel, and that will be good enough. There's no future for the BBC going down that route. But at the same time, the people who are trying to dismantle the BBC, as has been mentioned before, are press rivals, people around Rupert Murdoch. They have a vested interest in destroying their strongest rival. Off the record, you talk to hacks from the other papers, and they're quite open about this, that this is what it's about. It's about destroying the BBC as a competitor. I mean, when we made the Fake Shake Panorama at the end of last year, we suddenly had intervention from the Attorney General saying we shouldn't be showing it legally. There was no legal basis for it, and it felt very much to me that those strings were being pulled by Rupert Murdoch. And I think that's what's going on now with the government's attack on the BBC at the moment. I think those strings are being pulled. So, what am I going to say? I'm going to say, sack the cronies, sort out management, dump the BBC Trust, decimate the press office, get news to break more stories, but don't axe the budgets, don't smash the programmes which bolster the BBC and really get the country on side with the BBC. Because if we destroy this institution, we really will be destroying a national treasure.
Marion Jones. Please welcome our fifth panellist tonight, Director of Strategy at the BBC, James Purnell.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. Since Rachel mentioned France, I should say I grew up in France. And I first fell in love in the outskirts of Paris, listening to Radio 4, which you could receive on longwave in the suburbs of Paris, and listening to Breakaway, Sport on 4, from our own correspondent. And if we were having this, no one would have this debate in France. Everyone in France would think that not only was the BBC a national treasure, it was a global treasure. But we're not in France, we're here. And so I thought I would start by defining what a national treasure is. And a national treasure, according to the Oxford Dictionary, is an institution regarded as being emblematic of a nation's cultural heritage or identity. And Marion and Andrew are right. The BBC does make mistakes, has made really significant mistakes in the last 10 years. Savile, most obvious among them, but the DMI project, which wasted £100 million, the severance payments, which were also referred to. So I'm in no way saying that BBC is perfect. But if you go out and ask the audience, if you go out and ask people who pay for the BBC, who own the BBC, as Melvin quite rightly said, they do think that the BBC is a national treasure. 7 out of 10 people think that the BBC is a great ambassador for the country. And when people are asked which institutions in the country they are proudest of, the BBC is in the top 4 behind the monarchy, the army, and the NHS. So I think, for now, I think we probably agree that it is a national treasure. It is emblematic of that identity. Actually, it helps to forge that identity. It's not true that people don't consume the BBC anymore. 99% of households use the BBC every week, and we think the other 1% is actually on holiday. So pretty much everybody uses the BBC every week. When asked to name one organisation that they trust for news, 6 out of 10 people say the BBC. The next highest is on 10%. And when you go and look and ask people what they think about the programmes, Brits rate their TV higher than any other nation around the world, and BBC Two comes third of all the channels around the world, and BBC One comes out on top. So I think it probably is a national treasure. I think we help to create that identity. But in a way, maybe we should ask ourselves not, is it a national treasure, but should it be a national treasure? Because we absolutely agree that the BBC needs reform. We absolutely agree that the BBC needs to change. But we don't agree that the BBC is an anachronism. Actually, I think if the BBC didn't exist today, there would be very, very good reasons for inventing it. But given that so much of the argument's already been made, I thought I'd try something slightly different and let my impartiality slip for the first time since I came back to the BBC and make, since it's The Spectator, the right-wing case for the BBC. And I want to bring forward 5 reasons for why right-wingers should love the BBC. First of all, the clue's in the title. It's the British Broadcasting Corporation. In a country that is in many ways federalising, where our identities are changing, the internet is sort of brigading us into tinier and tinier groups, what is going to bring us together as well as the BBC? What will make sure that we have a single national conversation, not in a shallow or jingoistic way, in a way that goes right at the hardest things that disturb us, that separate us, but to make sure that we can have one conversation where we talk about all those things and get to better answers. Secondly, we widen choice. The news on the BBC means that people have a choice between impartial news and entirely free news. Actually, arguably, because there's impartial, regulated news from broadcasters, but particularly from the BBC, that means that we're much more comfortable about having a totally free news, as absolutely we should from newspapers. So we widen choice. We do the same in entertainment. I mean, probably the best way of illustrating that is programmes. Bake Off, Wolf Hall, The Archers, Today programme, Radio 3. These are programmes which you could argue in theory would be provided by the market, but they're not actually provided anywhere else in the world by the market. So we widen choice. And we bring Britain to the world. 200 million people listen to the World Service every week. 300 million people consume some kind of programme by the BBC. More Chinese people watch Sherlock than there are British people in the whole country. When Xi Jinping came to the UK recently for his state visit, he met a Dalek. Now, for anyone worried, we did ensure that there were very strong precautions against any reverse engineering, but we did keep him away from the sonic screwdrivers and the TARDIS, just in case he was able to reverse engineer it. And that role of bringing Britain to the whole of the world is one which also creates exports. Businessmen from overseas who use the BBC are more likely to invest in the UK. Fourthly, we're pro-competition. We are the most pro-competition public service anywhere in the country. 2/3 of our costs are already competed. We're going to increase that to 80% by getting rid of the internal quotas. We have a pure purchaser-provider split. I mean, people in the election were arguing about the 5% of the NHS spending which goes on competition. We're going to be up at 80%. This is an organisation that, from a policy wonk view on the right, should be absolutely being celebrated as a model of the kind of public service reform that a right-winger might want to see. And finally, we help to grow the creative industries. Yes, there's some crowding out from having the BBC, but there's also a huge amount of crowding in. And anyone who looks at this ends up concluding that the BBC has a clear net positive effect on the amount of jobs and growth that we have in the creative industries. Look at the strength of those creative industries. They are happening in part because of the BBC, not despite it. But my final argument, if I can, is maybe not a very spectator-friendly argument. It's a small c conservative argument, that it works. If you look at the programmes, they are in greater creative strength than ever before. When I grew up in France, I had that tiny, limited amount of content from Longwave. Now we have fantastic sport, the programmes on drama, on television, on the news, are on greater strength than they've ever been before. Contrary to what Andrew says, when you go and ask the public, they are more in favour of the BBC now than they were 10 years ago. They're more in favour of the licence fee. They trust the BBC more, despite the mistakes which Marion identified, and they rate us as better value for money than before, better value for money than Virgin or Sky, for example. So this is something that works in small c conservative sense, as well as in a wider ideological sense, and I think there's a very strong argument for why the BBC not only is a national treasure today, but with the right reform, should be a national treasure again in 10 years' time.
James Purnell. And our sixth panellist tonight is the author of Can We Trust the BBC? A notable journalist in his own right. Please welcome Robin Akin.
I think it's very interesting that we're here this evening, and, why are we here this evening? We're here because the BBC has a political problem. Why does the BBC have a political problem? It has a political problem because the Tories and the right feel they own the BBC nothing. Now, where does that sense of alienation on the right vis-à-vis the BBC come from? I was a BBC journalist, a BBC reporter for 25 years. I started in the late 70s and I quit in the mid-noughties. And I joined full of idealism about the BBC and very proud to have got the job. And then my career followed a pretty ordinary course through the BBC. I ended up working for national radio and television. I worked for the Money programme. What I discovered when I was working in the big London newsrooms was that there was an almost uniform political culture within the BBC. And this culture held in contempt Thatcher, Reagan, their economic policies, and much that ordinary people in the country hold dear. I found it to be, as an insider, I found myself actually alienated from the culture I was working in. And I was thinking, how does this square with the BBC's promise, enshrined in the Charter, of political impartiality? And it was that process of sort of individual alienation which eventually caused me to quit the BBC and write a book about it. If you think that I'm exaggerating things, remember this. Perhaps the apotheosis of what I'm talking about. In 1988, Polly Toynbee was appointed as the BBC's social affairs editor. Now, I'm a great admirer of Polly Toynbee. I often read her stuff. I think she's a great polemicist. I think she's a very talented and very interesting journalist. But I ask this simple question. Can you imagine the BBC having appointed someone, an equivalent person, on the right to that position? And I think the honest answer to that question is a resounding no, even today. I think that I'm surprised often when talking to BBC people how few of them understand the history, the early history of the BBC. The BBC was always a creature of the left. That is to say, it came into existence 88 years ago. It'll be 90 in 2 years' time. It came into existence because left-wing MPs in the House of Commons in the 1920s realized this broadcasting, this new phenomenon which was broadcasting, radio, was going to be an immensely powerful political tool, and they felt that it had to be in some way restrained, which was why the idea of a public corporation came into being. The other one which came into being at about the same time was the Forestry Commission. So these were sort of guarding national assets. And of course, in those days, there were very few wavelengths. So effectively, the BBC had a monopoly. And it was very important in those days. It was seen as being very important that the thing had to be impartial for obvious reasons, because there was only one station and you couldn't let it be either of the right or of the left. And I think for the first 40 years, actually, the BBC managed by and large to stay true to that original vision of an impartial broadcaster. But in the 60s, aunties unloosed her stays, and what then happened was that they let it all hang out, and what hung out was the true beating heart of the BBC, which was a left-wing heart. Now, having said all that, and having said, making my case that the right has no reason to love the BBC, I also think that there's no existential threat to the BBC. I think there's a lot of hype in this debate. Why is there no existential threat to the BBC? Well, here's one simple statistic. 5 million people, 5 million different individuals every week listen to The Archers. Now, imagine that audience, and imagine the politician who wants to take that programme away from that audience. I mean, that politician has a death wish. Look at the Today programme. The Today programme, the programme I used to work for, and which I still listen to religiously, is a massive influence on the programme. Its audience of more than 7 million people a week, individuals I mean, some of whom will tune in 6 days a week, that 7 million people represents the bulk of the educated and politically aware middle class in the country. There is no way that any politician, any government, is going to dismantle the BBC. It's in the interests of the left, however, to talk up this threat to the BBC. Polly Toynbee was at it just a few weeks ago. She said, and I quote, "This new government is off the leash, free to follow its instincts. It's a grave risk to the BBC. Don't underestimate how deep the loathing is." I think that's way over the top, actually. I think that many Tory MPs, many Tories actually, have a great affection for parts of the BBC. But what the right wants is for the BBC to live up to that original promise to be impartial. And frankly, it isn't. So, we come then to what is on the table as far as the BBC is concerned. What is on the table as far as the BBC is concerned is a degree of belt-tightening. And I say that that'll be a very good thing for the BBC. I'm not going to rehearse all those scandals which you're wearisomely familiar with. The overpaid executives, the inefficiencies. Damn it, when I was in the BBC, we kept shifting around from premise to premise. I can't remember exactly, James Purnell may be able to correct me, I can't remember how much it cost to shift BBC journalists from their fairly new headquarters at White City back into central London. I think it was over £1 billion. It was a massive sum of money. There's one thing which can be saved immediately, is to say, right, we've got these premises, we'll stick with them for the time being. Don't forget, the BBC's licence fee brings in nearly £4 billion a year. And this is the crucial point. That £4 billion a year is guaranteed. Unlike Sky or unlike any of the other media operators in the country, which are all scrambling around for revenue, the BBC can absolutely rely that next year it'll get the same amount of money that it got this year, near enough. And in addition, we've got BBC Worldwide. Reference has been made to it already, but the thing is that BBC Worldwide does a pretty poor job, actually. And what the BBC needs, in my view, is a little injection of entrepreneurial spirit to make use not only of the back catalogue, which is invaluable, but also the repository of craft skills that exists in the BBC, which could be used to make world-beating programmes along the lines of, where is the BBC equivalent, for instance, of The Sopranos or The Wire? Where are these programmes which which are really massive programmes? They're not there because the BBC won't chance its arm and spend the money in the way that it should do to make programmes which are really world beaters. One final point, if I may. Yes, is the BBC a national treasure? I think in many ways it is, but like all heirlooms, it needs to be taken down off the wall occasionally and given a bit of a polish and a clean-up. And what I think the BBC really needs to do to restore its reputation with the whole country is to return to the values that made it great in the first place. And that is to be even-handed, fair-minded, and impartial. That's what the BBC should do.
Robin Akin. Right, let's have the House lights up, please, so I can take some questions from the floor. But before I do, let me just pick up a couple of points that were made. James Pennell, what do you say to Robin Akin's point that the BBC's political problem is that the Tories and the right don't owe you anything?
I don't agree with the premise that the BBC isn't impartial. I mean, actually, the Spectator have done a fantastic job of taking a sample of people who work for the BBC, and I think if you took all of our political views and amalgamated them, we'd end up centre or maybe even centre-right, which is, when you ask the public, is exactly where they put the BBC. When the public are asked to rank the main media outlets in the country, they put the BBC just to the right of centre, round about where the Times is. But the key thing for us in terms of charter review is not to curry favour with any government or not to have anybody owing us anything. That would be impossible with our impartiality. And actually, despite charter review coming immediately after the election, I think BBC News worked very successfully in making sure that our coverage was impartial and independent. We just need to make a good case that we got the right set of reforms and a good vision for the future of the BBC.
In what way is the BBC News channel more impartial than Sky News?
They're both regulated. I don't think they are. I don't think BBC News is more impartial than Sky News.
You don't?
No.
So it doesn't have to be funded by the licence fee to be impartial?
No, I didn't say that. I think having...
No, I know. I'm just trying to check.
What it does do is it creates investment to have what is, one of the most successful news organisations in the world. And I think Alan Rusbridger put it very well the other day. At a time when, for example, foreign correspondence or investigations are being scaled back, having the licence fee to fund that kind of news widens choice in the market.
Andrew Bridgen?
Well, I want to know. I was pretty disappointed with the BBC last night. On BBC Radio 1 at 9 o'clock, the BBC gave airtime to a radicalised British jihadi who told the young audience how he'd managed to give the slip to our intelligence services, got out of the country, went to fight in Syria. He was fairly graphic about having seen people have their heads cut off, mutilations, arms cut off. And I think he topped it all by being allowed to, given a platform on the BBC at this time. I don't know who on earth authorised it, and it was certainly, I'm ashamed that it was paid for by some of my licence fee money. He said his greatest thrill in the world was taking the life of a non-believer. That was on the BBC last night.
Why does that show bias? It just shows bad judgment, maybe, but not bias.
Well, who's going to hold the BBC to account for that decision? Who decided to air that programme days after what's happened in Paris on a BBC platform, promoting it to an audience of exactly the sort of people who might go out there and carry on and do it? I mean, in what way is that being responsible?
But if the BBC runs something, it doesn't mean it's promoting it, does it? It's covering, trying to get its viewers or listeners to understand the warped ideology of the people you're talking about.
But on a platform where it's exactly for the demographic who might be influenced to go and do it, I think that was grossly irresponsible. And where do I go and complain about that, and who's going to do anything about it?
Well, there are massive complaints procedures if you wish to go down them. That I can assure you. My editor spends half his life dealing with them, usually about me. Rachel Johnson, what would you like to say to that point?
Well, I mean, maybe it's because I am more of the centre-right, but I struggle to detect sort of a sort of axis of evil between the BBC and the Guardian that we've heard tonight. I just don't get that. And you say that could you imagine a Polly Toynbee of the right being hired? Well, we're very lucky. We've got Nick Robinson, who used to chair the Young Conservatives at Oxford. Nobody queries his credentials in the way that they query it when somebody from The Guardian comes to the BBC. If I think there's any bias at all, I think there is a liberal bias. And that's a bias I'm quite comfortable with.
With a
myself.
small L?
Yeah, L.
Okay. Robin Akin?
Small L.
I think, we could bandy around individual instances of what we consider to be bias. I'm thinking more about the cultural mindset inside the organisation. For instance, I'll give you an example which has struck me recently, which is the way in which the debate about allowing Syrian immigrants, Syrian migrants into the country I think that the concerns of a large portion of the population who fear further immigration is not properly represented in the BBC's outlook. The BBC starts from a position, and it is no coincidence that over the front door, the motto is "Nations shall speak peace unto nation." What that does, it means that there's a bias, if you will, towards internationalism. In this particular instance, it means that there is a rather undue and over-relaxed view of migration into the country. I remember back in the 90s trying to raise the question with various editors, actually, and into the noughties, the question of the pace of immigration into the country. But I was looked at, if you raised that sort of question back then, you were looked upon as being...
Racist.
Yes, actually. And it's a very intimidating thing, actually. The internal culture of the BBC, there are lots of people, like James, for instance, very articulate, very well educated, very self-confident. Trying to make a case against such people in the ordinary forums of the BBC is not always easy. And that is why a groupthink arises. And it's very evident on some of these big social issues where, frankly, UKIP has come to prominence in the past few years, but UKIP was there 10 years ago. UKIP was there 15 years ago. No one was listening to them inside the BBC.
All right. James Brunel, is it not the case that previous director generals have said that on matters like the rise of Thatcher, immigration is a major issue determining how people might vote, and attitudes to Europe and the euro, that the BBC did not reflect the variety of views in the country?
Yes, that was a director of news, and I think actually Robin is right about immigration, and of course we get things wrong. I mean, these are really complex social changes, and trying to be impartial in a world where people have got really strongly held views in different directions is not something that you are always going to get right. We do get it wrong, but when we get it wrong, people can complain. I mean, there are 250,000 complaints a year about the BBC. I think that's 10 times as much as Ofcom receives about the whole of the rest of the broadcast industry. And Andrew is not right to say that we're afraid of external regulation. We have said quite happily that we will move to either an Ofcom or an Ofbeeb, entirely independent of...
Sorry, an Ofcom or an Off...
Ofbeeb is...
Or a new Quango?
An external regulator. So a single...
Just for the BBC?
A single external regulator. That's not our proposal, actually. That's a proposal other people have made. So we're saying we are quite happy, for the first time in the BBC's history, for impartiality to be determined by a completely external regulator. So that is something... And I think that will actually improve the system that we have at the moment.
Hold on, you'll get your chance. Mervyn Bragg, you said it was because of the BBC that London has become the world capital of the arts. I mean, I think New York and Paris may quibble with that description of London. What is undoubtedly true is that New York and Paris are huge centres of the arts. New York has almost no public service broadcasting at all, and Paris has very weak public service broadcasting. So it's not really essential, is it?
Well, I quarrel with you. I think London is way ahead of the others. You just look at the number of... If you go out tonight in London, you can go to over 300 theatres, there are opera houses, concert halls, there are more galleries than any other major city, there are more first exhibitions, the big auction houses are here as well as in New York. I think we can tot all that up and say... And I think it's a sort of rather Premier League game, but I'll play it first. There's a churn that we have in London, which is partly to do with London. Just like with the finance here as well as Parliament. In London, we have the centre of the television industry, the centre of the radio industry, the centre of the newspaper industry. It's where film people get their finance. You've got film there, the centre of the theatre industry, the centre of the musicals. So they churn in with each other, and people can exercise their skills, build in different areas, and put together this extraordinary thing. I don't think many people would quarrel with the fact that at the moment, New York in the 1950s, yes, Paris in the, say, 1880 to the maybe 1920s, yes, but no, honestly, if we could sit down and have a bit of time, I'd try to prove that London is the centre, and I think the BBC is very important to that. Now, whether we're not the BBC, there are other companies like ITV, Channel 4, or the new companies coming online would have just that, would have a similar sort of importance, is impossible to judge.
Don't you work for Sky Arts?
I do, yes.
So it's possible to have artistic programming
Absolutely.
without the BBC?
Oh, yes, there's no question. It is possible to have masses of sort
Well,
of
it's not
programs.
possible. It's happening.
Yeah, and it started to happen in the 60s after the Pilkington Report. And the Pilkington Report was expected to give the second channel to ITV, and it didn't. It condemned ITV as a money-grubbing second-rate or even 10th-rate outfit and gave the second channel to the BBC. That's essentially what happened. Hoggart-led, in a way, and a lot of people, including myself, applauded it. What happened was the most extraordinary thing, really, in the politics of 20th century broadcasting. ITV decided to outgun the BBC on its own ground. ITV came back with World in Action, with Brideshead Revisited, with
But
all
ITV had its own monopoly too. It had a
Yes,
monopoly
it had
of
a monopoly.
television advertising.
It had a monopoly.
So it was a duopoly.
It had a monopoly of money. But you keep diverting from the fact that are we talking about channels that can do well without the BBC, or how are these things financed? Now, the strange thing about the financing outside the BBC is that it doesn't seem to be flagging. More channels come on board. I mean, Sky Arts is a good channel. It's perfectly well funded.
Okay.
I needn't go because you look
No,
as if you're.
no, it's fine. Andrew Bridgen, are you, as Marion Jones said, are your strings being pulled by Rupert Murdoch?
No, I've never met Rupert, and he's not in my phone.
But you are on first name terms, clearly.
No. I think you're putting words into my mouth, Andrew.
No, you were the one that said Rupert.
No, not at all. I am concerned about the bias. I am concerned about the huge amount of taxpayers' money. But the BBC is a very, very big entity. 3.7 billion of licence fee income, which is possibly set to rise by CPI going forward. 1.3 revenue from BBC World. When you're talking about 5 billion, more than twice the annual budget of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office.
Do you agree with Robin Akin that actually, for all the bluster and all the talk on the Tory backbenches, that the BBC is actually not under threat?
I think there could be some tinkering, but I think you have made the point. There are probably...
Well, tinkering's not under threat, then, is it?
No, it is not under threat.
All right, let's go to the floor. Hands up. There's a gentleman there. We'll keep your hand up. We'll get a microphone to you. We've got another microphone here. There's a gentleman there. Yes, sir.
Given that about 15%, Roger Kendrick, given that about 15% of the people in this country work for the public sector and about 85% for the private sector, isn't it true that the BBC would represent this country better if it acted like a commercial organisation? And if it's so good, why doesn't it have the courage to let people choose to buy what they want from the BBC rather than criminalising 150,000 people a year and putting 40 in prison?
Okay. James Burnell.
So we could try and be a subscription broadcaster. There's actually nowhere else in the world where the kind of range of channels that the BBC has and the quality of programmes is funded in that way. And what is most likely that would happen is we would become a bit more like Sky. And there'd be two dangers with that. One, obviously, it would crowd out Sky. So we've got a very good subscription broadcast in this country. But secondly, it costs Sky roughly £1.5 billion a year to run their subscription system. That's pretty much the amount we spend on TV programmes. So instead of spending that money on TV programmes, we'd be spending on running a subscription system. And secondly, what you would do is you would take away something which is wonderful about the UK, which is competition for quality. There's competition between ourselves, between Sky, ITV, Channel 4, now Netflix, Amazon. And what that means is that overall, we get better programmes than if the BBC were taken out of that. So having one part of the market, which actually is roughly about 15%. You know, the BBC is currently just under 20% of broadcasting revenues. As a result of this latest financial deal, will go down to 12%. So that fits exactly with your proportions. What you get is better programmes overall. And the best example of that is when we have had our money cut in the last few years, ITV have been able to cut their programming budget as well. And what that means is that we are getting fewer British programmes in this country than we were 5 years ago. It's gone down by 15%. So actually, having the BBC as part of the market and creating greater competition means that we all produce better programmes.
Rachel?
I'd like to make a point as somebody who's worked for newspapers all my life, apart from the 2.5 years I worked for The World Tonight, or as my husband called it, The World to Sleep, because he never got through a single edition when I was on it. And it's this, that there is a point about Rupert, which is it is unfair that the BBC is a publisher to the extent it is, and it has a website that is the third most visited website across the globe. And obviously, it's a wonderful showcase for Britain. The range and the depth of everything the BBC does is advertised on the website, as well as the rolling news and all the rest of it. But this is an unfair competitive. It puts the newspapers at a competitive disadvantage. And as somebody who makes my salary from newspapers, I think that Tony Hall is right, and I wish he would do what he promises and scale back the range of text publishing on the website, because it is unfair and it is driving newspapers to the wall.
But this always comes into the same point, that the objection is to the BBC's exceptionality. And I raised that in my thing, said that this is a real objection. And it didn't used to matter when there was two systems, didn't matter very much. Now that it's a sore thumb, it's an exceptionality, it's overprivileged, and that is a very sensible point. But my point is, and I know it seems to be dressed up with the Matter of Britain phrase, but you used it as well, I'm pleased to say, it is now in a different stage than the other broadcasting channels. Whether you are going to admit it or not, I'm going to finish. And that is to say that it's been going for nearly 90 years, and it has done things inside this country, and it is owned still, although we don't exercise it as licence fee payers as much as we should. It's owned by the country, feels that it speaks to and for the country, and it is an exceptional case. And if a broadcasting system or a broadcasting ecology can't take on about 12 to 15% of it being in a special case, when that special case was a foundational block in the whole caboose over the last 90 years, we're in a poor way, especially as that special case, as James pointed out quite rightly, again and again and again, scores very highly on public appreciation, trust, and so on and so forth.
All right, let me go to the gentleman there with the microphone. Yes, sir?
Is it true that the BBC is the largest single customer for the Guardian newspaper? And if that is so, what does that tell you about the mindset of the people working for the BBC? And could the panel tell me, when they were working in the BBC, not after they left, did they actually take the Guardian newspaper?
Yes, Marion?
I don't mind answering that. It's a very old figure that's put out. What actually happens in the BBC, as in everywhere else these days, is people read things online. So they're actually, you're probably more likely to find them looking at the Daily Mail sidebar of shame than the Guardian most of the time. Paper copies, even when I left in February, were dying out. Newspapers really are not where people get their news in terms of bits of paper anymore. That doesn't really happen with journalists.
Okay, Robin, were you forced to read The Guardian when you worked in the BBC?
I'm sort of... I feel I've been cast in the role here of somebody who wants to tear the thing down. I don't want to tear the BBC.
No, I'm just asking you what newspapers you read.
And I think, the thing about the BBC is that, of course, people in the BBC read The Guardian. Why wouldn't they? Because they're all, your typical young recruit into the BBC is someone who's...
Recruited by an advert in The Guardian.
But is probably a young, very bright, well-educated arts graduate, probably from one of the older universities. With that time of life, that sort of background, comes a package of ideas and views, and these translate into the output of the BBC. And although Melvin talks about competition and so on, and there are areas of British broadcasting which are very competitive, remember this: if you look at national radio that is intelligent, talk national radio, really the BBC still has a monopoly in that. And the monopoly which the BBC has in Radio 4 is something which is enormously persuasive and powerful in terms of moulding the opinions in the country. There is no competitor to Radio 4.
You mean there's no national talk station?
Yeah. If you're interested
on FM.
Yeah. If you're interested in politics, where are you going to go in the morning? You're going to go to the Today programme, aren't you, if you're any sense? Because where else are you going to go? Right. to hear the top politicians, and that matters.
Okay, I want to bring some more people in. Gentleman in a white shirt, keep your hand up. And, we'll stick with another white shirt. There. Well, let's go to you first, because the mic is nearest. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Peter Blackman, Save Our BBC. We had the Communications Act, which enabled us to have hundreds of commercial radio stations. And where have they all gone? Middle of the ground, where they can attract the funding, and the BBC remains unique and special and incredibly important. If you look at the countries that had the equivalent of a public service broadcast of the BBC, all of those that have lost it know that they can't replace it and decry that loss and know they've lost something of great value. As Melvin said, the BBC is truly a national institution.
Okay,
and
have you got a question?
Yes.
Because we've already had 6 speeches.
To Andrew Bridgen, do you think that the 97% of your constituents who use an average of 18 hours of the BBC every week agree with what you've been saying? And is it not an example of a democratic, mature society that we can find out what it is that's behind extremists?
Okay.
And
No, you're making another speech.
Well,
Andrew Bridgen, do your constituents agree with you?
Well, I was returned with a vastly increased majority only a few months ago, so I presume that isn't a level of accountability.
Yeah, but how big was the BBC as part of your campaign?
The BBC is great value if you use it. One of my problems is, as I tried to explain in my opening address, is the lack of accountability. The BBC should be free from the influence of any government. I totally agree with that as a national broadcaster. But because of the way it's funded, by compulsory, again, with criminalisation for non-payment, it is actually free from the influence of its customers. And that is unhealthy. And that's why I believe you've got the management problems we have at the BBC and the subsequent scandals that the BBC often becomes the story now.
But what do you say to, I think was implicit in the question, which is that if you go to a purely market-led television system or broadcast system, as opposed to the mixed economy that we have now, and we've moved from a mixed economy where the public service was predominant to the commercial service is now bigger than the public service, that the kind of programs that are regarded as high quality, like the Today programme on Radio 4 or the 10 o'clock news on BBC One, everywhere else in the world, they are not done by the private sector.
I have never proposed that BBC Radio should go to subscription. It's a subscription model. It's not going to work. I always thought that the subscription model should be used for BBC television and maybe £30, £35 a year put onto council tax to fund BBC Radio, although I would maintain that I do not know why we fund BBC Radio 1 now when there is so much other commercial offerings that could fill that slot. I don't think it's doing anything that's
So I'm
unique.
unclear then what you think should happen, that the BBC should not be privatised?
I think
we should
my
pay more
model would be
council
that the
tax.
BBC is a world brand. It could make a lot of money from BBC worldwide that it doesn't. I would like to see BBC TV, and I believe it will go eventually to subscription model, but the radio, I think, would need to be put onto a charge onto council tax.
To the council tax. Have you told your constituents that?
I have made my views very clear, Andrew.
Well, you have now. Right, let me see some more hands, as we've still got a few minutes more. There's a gentleman there, a gentleman right in the front. Keep your hands up, we'll get a mic to you. It's quite hard to see. All right, you've got it, then you better go.
Hello, thanks, guys. Yeah, James, as you know, we've met a few times actually at BBC Trust and Guardian Law event. But no, the question I want to ask is well, too. Robin Akin, have you heard of LBC? Because you did mention there's not a rival to Talk. The BBC have an monopoly on Talk Radio. But the other thing I want to ask as well is that privatisation isn't the answer to everything. Look how successful the railways have been since they've been privatised. And so I want to ask Andrew Bridgen, is he going to categorically rule out privatising the BBC?
Right,
because if it was up to the Tories,
Okay,
they'd privatise
these are two
oxygen.
questions, and you're now verging on a speech too. So the first question is the LBC. I mean, I suppose your point would be, LBC, you can get it on the web nationally, but it doesn't have an FM national wavelength or set of wavelengths.
True. But also, you know, there's a huge hurdle for any entrant into the national radio market, which is that BBC Radio 4 is so very good. And it's so very good because it's had, you know, decades and decades of experience at that.
So why would you want to undermine it?
Well, I don't wish to undermine it. What I mean, my whole point is that I think that the BBC needs to do what it says on the tin. And all it needs to do, in my view, is to live up to its pledge of impartiality. Were it to do that, MPs of the right, like Andrew, would have no complaint with it. Why?
Okay.
You know, the thing is that a mixed culture of broadcasting seems to me to be an entirely healthy thing. You want, 1,000 flowers to bloom. You want as many voices as possible in the mix. I have no objection at all to the idea of public sector broadcasting, public service broadcasting. I think it's a very fine ideal. It's a question of how you deliver that and if you deliver it properly. That's
All right.
the real problem.
Andrew Bridgham, the second question was, will you rule out, in your view, privatising the BBC?
Well, it's not actually within my gift to rule it
No,
out.
but that's your view.
My view, no, I don't think we're not going to privatise the BBC. It belongs to the people. There was some thoughts that maybe it could become a mutual, where it belonged to the people who subscribed. That would be one possible future scenario, and I could see that happening. The BBC is not the only public service broadcaster in the UK. Channel 4 is a public service broadcaster.
But I thought your government wanted to privatise that.
No licence fee payers' money.
I thought your government wanted to privatise that.
I think that is a possibility that could be. And it would still maintain its public service duties.
Who's got the microphone over there? It's quite hard to see. Yes, sir. And then some hands up over there. Gentleman in the front row. And then down here. Very quickly, please.
Thank you very much. There's been a lot of talk about the high quality of programmes in the BBC, and they seem to focus on things that appear on Radio 4, for example, and some on television. Is it not the case that there aren't enough good quality programmes to go around all these channels that the BBC is spewing out? It's got 12 radio channels and 9 television channels, and I believe, is it not sensible to cut that down by at
that's
least
a very
50%?
good question. Let me put it to James Purnell. You're trying to do too much.
So that's one of the things that we are considering at the moment, because we have to find £700 million of savings. As Rachel was saying, we found another 150 million today, but we're going to have to find £550 million in the next charter, and that's inevitably going to lead to reductions or even possibly closures of services. But we want to avoid that if at all possible, and that's why we found the vast majority of our savings through efficiency. You know, we have saved £1.6 billion, 40% of our running costs in the last charter. When we get benchmark, we come out in amongst the very best, even compared to the private sector in terms of our overheads. So you're absolutely right. We are having to reduce the amount of shelf space. That's why we've done that with BBC Three. But we don't want to throw much lost services over the side if we can possibly avoid it.
But you're not going to close any television channels or any radio stations?
We're not ruling anything in or out.
You're not ruling anything?
We're not ruling anything in or out. We said explicitly that it was going to have to lead to reductions in services. We've announced some of that today. May lead to closure of services, but that's not what we want to do. We want to, if we can possibly find it through efficiency or through less damaging cuts, that's exactly what we'll do.
Was it a sensible use of licence payers' money to spend £20 million buying in an American format called The Voice?
Well, as people know, we've now lost The Voice. It's gone to ITV. I think it was a very BBC programme. It's absolutely right to give shows which appeal to young people, appeal to diverse groups. But actually, if you compare...
But should you have bought it? My point is, should you have bought it in? You developed Strictly, which I would suggest a private company probably would not risk doing, because it seems so much of a long shot to reinvent Victor Sylvester. But you didn't invent The Voice. You brought in The Voice from America, and as ITV have shown, they can do it. So my question was that a sensible use of licence payers' money?
Yeah, absolutely. But we do that in exceptional circumstances. We've done it with 5 formats: University, Challenge, The Voice, Dragon's Den, a couple of others. Dragon's Den is a format that was brought in from Japan. It wasn't hugely successful. It's been The Apprentice is another. It's been transformed by the BBC into something that people forgotten was ever a format. So, it used to be that 30% of BBC One's schedules was that kind of import. It's now nothing, and there's just 5 formats which we bring in. So the vast majority of our content is original and distinct.
The gentleman over there, and the microphone down here to the front, please. If you're heading that way, fine, and then we'll go to the gentleman over there. Yes, sir.
Hello, I just wanted to ask the panel, the majority, not quite all of you...
No, you're going to have to choose one or two, because we're running out of time.
...have worked for the BBC, and I wanted to ask, you can choose, Andrew, which one you think you should ask. Do they think that their careers would have been as successful, or the opportunities that have been presented without the BBC?
Mine went downhill.
What, with the BBC?
Well, I mean, I left a full-time job at the FT to take a staff contract at the BBC, and I loved it, but it was probably a really bad decision.
Okay.
I never recovered.
Marion Jones.
Well, I was very lucky. I was at the BBC for a very long time, and I managed to work on really interesting stuff with really great people, a tremendous team at Newsnight and again at Panorama, and for that matter at the radio programme. So, yeah, I loved it. I had a absolutely tremendous time. It's a shame.
But what's your problem?
I don't have a problem.
Oh. Well, I thought you did.
I suppose my problem was because I wouldn't keep quiet about Savile, I got kicked out in the end.
Ah, okay. That could equally have happened with a commercial broadcaster, couldn't it?
If Savile had been appearing on a commercial broadcaster, yeah.
Okay. Did your career go up, down, or sideways thanks to the BBC?
No, I had a great career, and I really enjoyed it.
Okay.
But it set up the thing was, it set up a conflict. And I'd say this, that I worked for one editor at the BBC, and one editor only, who I really felt allowed all sorts of ranges of opinion onto the programme, and that was Rod Liddell. And he was very unusual in BBC terms, because Rod was somebody who was prepared to be iconoclastic and rude and cheeky, and he was a splendid editor. And look what happened to him. They drummed him out. And
Well,
that actually
hold on a minute. He's a senior columnist for The Spectator. That's far more important than editing the Today programme. I mean,
Rod was
let's
my,
go.
yeah, he was on the World Tonight.
All right,
I
that's
agree.
enough
I
on
agree
Rod
with
Liddell.
that.
He'll want a pay rise. He'll work at
competition.
Yeah. Yes.
Me?
Gentlemen there, whoever's got the mic, it's impossible
That's
to see.
me then. Yeah, this is about an argument that's being raised a lot about the BBC being for the elite Oxbridge breed and not there for the young upcoming people.
I need a question. We're getting close to the end of time.
That's simple.
I'm losing the will to live if you don't give me a question.
Okay, let me try. How do you argue about the argument that the BBC is for the elite, not for everyone else, as in terms of working with the BBC, not necessarily listening and watching the programs?
Okay, who got that question? I'm sure it is, but could you repeat it for us, please? Because none of us could understand that.
My understanding is this gentleman saying that the BBC is an elitist organisation.
Right. Okay. Is that right, sir?
Sometimes it seems like that.
Okay.
It does seem like
Right.
that. So what's the argument you can raise about that?
okay.
Like,
So-
is it yes or no, and what
there
can
is
you do about that?
Okay, the gentleman's right, isn't it? There is a sense. The BBC is pretty elitist. James Brunel. Speaking of the elite.
Everybody uses the BBC pretty much every week, as I said. You're right, the BBC isn't diverse enough. We're trying to make it more diverse. In terms of our graduate recruitment, for example, 45% of the people we recruit are now from non-white backgrounds, but we've got a lot further to go. And I think actually the biggest reason why the BBC could not be a national treasure in 10 years' time is if we don't change our services, change our programmes to appeal more to people from diverse backgrounds, people who are younger, people who consume the BBC less. At the moment, the vast majority of people do consume the BBC and do get value from it, but if we don't address what you're talking about in 10 years' time, that might not be the case, and that would be wrong in principle, and it'd be bad for the survival of the BBC.
Okay. Thank you. No, I'm sorry, we've run out of time. Thank you for that question. Thank you for that question. What bit of you don't run? We've run out of time. We've run out of time. Thank you. Right. So, we've actually gone way beyond our time, but I think it's been such a important and entertaining and informative debate that we've had tonight. There are other questions we could have taken. We should have finished 15 minutes ago, and yet I don't think almost any of you have left the hall. Maybe you don't know there's a tube strike. No, I'm just joking. Just joking. I want to take just a quick vote, and it's this. Who's happy broadly to continue with the BBC as it is for another 5 or 10 years with this charter and Euroland, or who would like to see major changes to the BBC before it gets its charter renewed? Who would broadly like to stay with the status quo? Let me see your hands.
We're allowed to vote
Well, I think we know what you think. And who would like to see some pretty radical changes to the BBC? Well, a substantial minority, but a minority. Who has yet to make up their mind? Well, in that sense, tonight has been a complete success because we have clarified the views for that. But a clear majority there want the BBC Charter to be renewed on broadly the terms that the BBC is currently under. Let me thank Brew and Dolphin again for making tonight possible. Let me thank you for coming. You've been such a wonderful audience. I said there would be a present for you. On the way out, you'll get a little red pouch, a little red pocket. What you do is you stick it on the back of your phone. And in that way, you can hold your credit cards or your business card or your Oyster card, and you can advertise The Spectator. In fact, you will advertise. And it means, thanks to this incredibly productive and efficient little gizmo, you can lose your mobile phone and your credit cards all in one go. That's how generous I am. And it's our contribution to improving national productivity. Before you go, ladies and gentlemen, please give a really strong round of applause for our wonderful panel.